Myself. Okay. So I decided to add a sort of preamble titled Beyond Technocracy, and you'll see why, as a kind of theme for thinking about these wider questions. And I should be honest, my expertise that I can bring to this is in some respects more on the political economy side, although like anybody who's a citizen of the world, one wants to apply one's insights from whatever research one is doing to some of the biggest challenges. And of course, sustainability is one of those biggest challenges. I don't need to really dwell on why we're here, but I'll just remind us why we're here. That I think we're here because we believe that we wish to protect nature, and our desire is to bring about change, and on a scale that would really be unprecedented if we don't let this. If we don't tackle this now. And I've just on the right-hand side is a typical graph you'll have seen many times that motivates our concerns in terms of at least greenhouse gases. Now, when we think about the political economy of this, the thing we have to remind ourselves is there's nobody in charge. There are lots of people who have a piece of this who, for one way or another, will influence the direction of the world. And why would I say that? Because any of you who've taken an economics course will know that economists, at least, are very fond of invoking how the world would look if there were a benevolent social planner in charge. And then we use that to motivate the kinds of policies we would like to see. Now, nobody seriously believes that's the world we live in, but it's thought of as a powerful fiction for thinking about how we would like things to look. Oh, I have to stay. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry, I'd strayed out of my box. It's like a football manager. They have these things at football matches. The two big questions I want to ask is the challenge that this is posing not just to the climate, but also to democracy. And I want us to think about the kinds of institutions we need to respond to this challenge. It's fair to say, even among those who think this is a serious issue, there is no consensus on the actions and the scale and pace of change that we need. I think there is a consensus maybe on the urgency, but the exact sequencing and nature of the policies that are needed is much debated. Although the issues are global, many of the issues are confronted at a level of countries trying to make decisions, even if they're participating in major global conferences like the COP or whatever relevant meeting. And there are questions around, if we are going to take serious public action, how are we going to deal with the reality that some people will lose in this process? And I'll come back to that. And also there are cultural differences in the sense people feel very differently about the issues. There's lots of survey evidence to support that. What I produced here is just the distribution of opinion across countries from the Gallup World Poll, where they ask a question, and they have been asking a question every year since the early 2000s. How much do you care about problem of damage to the climate? And country by country, there are big differences. And we have to recognize that not everybody is of one mind when it comes to this. Within country, there's huge variation, but there's also variation across countries. So there are big debates that fundamentally have to happen at the level of national government in order to fuel the process of global cooperation. Now, what we know is that action is also very different across different countries. And here's just an illustration of that. This is just a map illustrating which countries in the world have committed to some form of net zero pledge. Even among those that have, the time frame in which they're doing it and the nature of the policies that they're contributing towards this are greatly variable. And so as someone who's interested in the political economy, the question arises, what can explain the differences in progress, the differences in decisions that are being made at country levels, like you're seeing on this map? Now, I think it's fair to say, for those who take the problem of climate change seriously, we are far behind where we think we need to be in combating that problem. Even worse, and this is particularly visible in certain countries, we could even be going backwards. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. But when you talk to people, either in the form of surveys or more long-form interviews, you realize that many citizens are concerned about the climate, but they're concerned about many other things too. And they want to know, is fighting climate change even feasible? Are we already beyond a point where this looks like a fruitless thing to do? And if we do it, are we able to do it in a way that is just? And these things that come out when you ask people about these issues. Now, I want to challenge us and say, isn't this really a problem of political failure? Our institutions are not giving it the prominence that many people think it has. And therefore, if you were taking the idea of what a benevolent social planner would do, you can think that it would be better if politics just got out of the way and people who know better ran the world. And that's what I call technocracy. That somehow the solution to climate change is more technocracy. And I'm going to argue that that is a deeply flawed view, but I have heard that view often enough that I think it needs confronting. Just a quick word on what it is we're thinking we need to do. We need to develop and switch towards greener lifestyles. We need to change the politics that would underpin this. And we need, arguably, to change the culture and society. And this is something I've written about. And that little diagram to the right there is a kind of an illustration of the way I think about this, the interdependence of policies, values, and institutions. Well, of course, what's at stake is not hard to describe. For many people, it's the future of the planet. But I think also it's challenging our political institutions. And I'll come back to that a few times in what I have to say. Because if this is perceived not just as a problem of the climate and the world, but as the failure of our political institutions, we're going to have much more profound consequences in other areas, not just in the area of climate. And these three somewhat provocative charts I've got for you here. The top one just shows something that I don't know how many people have seen this, but this is data on how many protests there are in the world, and it's a hockey stick. Basically, protest takes off in the world, and this is across all countries, in around 2010, really dramatically. And a good deal of that protest is climate related. But what are my other two charts showing? The one on the left is about revolutionary preferences from the World Values Survey. And I've done this relative to the average. And if you look in the most recent World Values Survey, there are far more people today than in the past saying they want revolutionary change. The question is, society must be radically changed. There are more people saying that. And furthermore, who's saying it? It's the young. Now, I'm not saying all these three things are intimately linked. I couldn't prove that for 1 second. But these are three background things that when we're thinking about all of this, I think we need to keep in view. Okay, now I come to technocracy. Is what we need more technocracy? What's technocracy? The control of government and society by an elite of technical experts. When I listen to a lot of the debate about climate, it doesn't say this explicitly, but there's an undertone that says, can't we just get politics out of the way and then the world will be a better place? It's the politicians ruining all of this. Now, I caricature a view. I'm sure nobody seriously believes that, but I'm going to say that this is really not the right way to think about the problem. Why do we think politics is a nuisance? Well, there's three very obvious reasons. One, it's not global. We mostly live in nation states. And nation states are, for better or worse, the primary unit of government that we have. So that doesn't sound like it's for fixing a global problem. That's so propitious. People are not attentive enough to the issue. I've told you there's lots of survey data, and I'll show you a little more in a moment, that says maybe people don't care that much about this, but the experts tell us we should. And also, that politics seems to be neglecting the distributional issues, whether they be across countries or within countries. So our technocrats could perhaps deal with that better than the politicians are doing it. I think this critique of politics is fundamentally misguided. Politics has to be the answer. It's not something that gets in the way. It's the only reason that collective action happens. We get together, we debate, we discuss, we have institutions that help us to do this. In democratic countries, we know what they are. And we have to work with them. We cannot simply think that the answer is to abandon what this. But I'm going to try and make this more forcefully as we go. The real question is, can we make our politics work? Can we make our politics more responsive to this issue? And if so, what would it take to do that? And also, does the state have the capacities to deliver? Are there places where, because of the state institutions we've inherited, and I'll come to this a little bit in a minute, they may be not good at doing the things we now need them to do, and I want to talk about that. But even though we're concerned about geopolitics, I think we cannot get away from the fact that most politics that matters is still happening within countries. It is not happening at the global level. Geopolitics or domestic politics? Well, here's an example. Trump withdraws from the Paris Agreement again. If you remember, he withdrew once during his first term, and he's withdrawn again. And there's this much overused quote here of Tip O'Neill, an American politician: all politics is local. At the end of the day, most of the politics that's meaningful in our lives, it could be super local, it could be what happens on our street or in our neighborhood, but even relative to the globe, national politics is kind of local. So we need to think how best we can work with fundamentally local politics when we care about a global issue. So what kind of political economy do we need to think about? And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of my kind of take on the last 60 years, post-war politics in a nutshell. That things that happened didn't happen because everyone agreed. Inherently in politics, there is disagreement. It's how we manage it that matters. There's almost no issue on which everyone agrees. So we can't think that the answer is to get everyone to agree. So we have political institutions. What do political institutions do? They select the people that we want to make the decisions on our behalf. We know how we do that. We typically use elections. And we also give them incentives to behave in particular ways when they've been elected, like being re-elected, or maybe subject to their behavior to judicial review, or whatever it would be. So politics at some level is simple. We pick people and we incentivize them. And if you say, how well have we done at that? Actually, not badly in a number of countries in the world, in the sense that there's huge progress in, say, the last 70 years in what states have contributed to our lives. An era in which people have built welfare states, provided education, healthcare. Many, many things have been done using this model of politics to deliver for us. So it's not impossible to make this model work. And I argue that the norm of reciprocity is very powerful here. We think of states delivering for us, and then we're willing to contribute taxation to fund the state and so forth. So I have a kind of broad narrative around that I believe in. A club of nations, I call them the common interest states, emerged in the last 70 years to do this really effectively. And of course, Sweden is a prime example of a country that's got a very effective and functioning state in this way. And this was a model, a social contract, if you like, that emerged in the Second World War, or after the Second World War. But you say, where was the climate? Where was nature in that model I'm giving you? It was marginalized. People, I mean, it was partly because people were not talking about this issue as much, certainly not as much as they are today. So it was never central to the settlement that provided people with public services. And the kind of politics we settled into for so long was kind of what I call left-right politics. Essentially, there were people who wanted more redistribution, less redistribution, but it was within a sort of narrow bounds. Of course, for the non-democracies in the world, life is a lot more complicated, and a lot of them around, and I'll kind of come back to that a little bit. And how much geopolitical cooperation did that model have? Well, some, and some pretty effective geopolitical cooperation. I'm thinking of the IMF, sort of serving as a broad macroeconomic umpire, if you like, both reporting on the behavior of countries and supporting them in certain times. So we did have a decent amount of geopolitical cooperation lying behind that model. But as I say, climate and nature was not central to it. So when it comes to thinking, well, why now we're being asked to reform or to think differently about the world, bringing these issues in, is it difficult? Well, if you haven't read this book, I very strongly recommend it. There is an updated version of this called Why We Disagree About Climate Change by Mike Hume, who's he's a professor of geography at Cambridge University. And he asks the question, why don't we all agree? And there's lots of reasons why we don't all agree. And the way not to think about it for sure is there are evil people and nice people, and the nice people should be agreed with, and the evil people shouldn't be allowed to have a voice. It's much more nuanced than that. Even among people, for example, who think there's a serious issue here, the means and the pace and the nature of the policies, there's massive disagreement. It's not like there's a sort of anything close to a consensus. But you might ask the question, what do people think? And I've alluded to that already. We can go out and ask people what they think. And their values differ, and the knowledge differs. A lot of people have very different views, not surprisingly. They rely on different sources, and different values too. Some people think that we should prioritize one thing or another. And how does that translate into action? Well, for citizens, we have our political actions. We can go protest, we can go vote. But we're also consumers. We can drive, say, electric vehicles rather than petrol vehicles because we think that's good for the planet. There's things we can do in our consumption, and firms can contribute by their production decisions. That's kind of what regular citizens like me can do. What about political elites and technocrats? The one thing that comes out very clearly is they are not very representative of citizens as a whole. Systematically, they have different views. And whether they're scientists who work on climate, which is an extreme example, when you look at their views of the world, they are just not in tune with the views of regular citizens. That doesn't mean they're right or wrong. That's the wrong view to take. They're just different. And very often, the people with the policy levers are not in line or in tune with the views of citizens as a whole. And we have to confront that. So then, what's holding things back? Well, one view is kind of lack of will, that people know that they need to do it, but they aren't able to become sufficiently convinced. Decision-making is very fragmented, both across countries, but across units within countries. I mean, a good example would be if you take a country like my own, like Britain, which has a net zero policy, there isn't a single organ of government that is responsible for all aspects of it. We have a transportation department, and clearly decarbonizing transport is important. We have an energy department, and decarbonizing energy is important. We have a housing department. We want to have new houses be well insulated. It's not like there's a single unfragmented part of government that deals with this. Maybe in other countries there is, but most countries, responsibility for delivering is highly fragmented. And we don't have any direct, as a consequence of that, we have lots of delivery capacity for different parts of government, but we don't typically have delivery capacity targeted expressly at dealing with climate and nature issues. It will be there in different fragmented places. So what about citizens? Well, it won't surprise you. This is from the Eurobarometer survey. If you ask citizens to tell you what are the two most important issues that concern them in the Eurobarometer, it won't surprise you that that's gone up over time. So I've just taken three time periods from the Eurobarometer survey, and from the 2016 to 21 period, people are more concerned. Well, I don't think that's so surprising. But when you line it up and say, oh yeah, but how concerned are they about climate versus the state of the economy? They're much less concerned about climate than they are the state of the economy. And if you add in inflation and unemployment, they are much, much less concerned. So we have to confront the fact that even though people care about the issue, it's an issue of priorities. So if they're being asked to contribute to something that can give them better healthcare, better education, or whatever, are they going to pick that, or are they going to pick the climate as a priority? This here, this is just think of this as displaying the following. I know some of you in the room are not, or many of you are not economists, but basically this is just saying the biggest single indicator of predicting your views on climate, you can put all sorts of controls into to look at this, is that people who have a tertiary education. So probably most people here, I'm tempted to do a show of hands, you have education beyond the age of 18, you are likely to be much more concerned about these issues than people who don't. That's a very, very robust finding across countries, all across surveys. So as we educate people, well, maybe we're getting people who are more concerned about this. The other thing to note is this is by birth cohort. So it's compared to people who were born before 1950. In fact, people who were born before 1950 are actually slightly more concerned about the planet than the people who were born in the 50 to 59, 60 to 69, etc. And then among the youngsters, maybe some in the room, who were born between 2000 and 2009, they're super concerned about the planet. Now, what's not well understood, and this, you'll see some of this in Mike Hume's book if you read it, is what shifts opinions and beliefs. There's now a lot of research. Indeed, there's a whole field called climate psychology, where people have tried to look and say, well, what would it take to shift people's values and beliefs? The one thing that doesn't seem to come out, there's a few studies that are a counterexample to what I've claimed, but I've trawled through a large number of studies, is significant environmental events do not have a durable impact on people's climate views. So things like, experiencing a flood or a significant weather event might at best have a temporary impact. Because a lot of people, the reason there's been so much research on that, it was kind of assumed that significant climate events would be the driver in the end of people's views about this, but that doesn't seem to be the case. I think we're only beginning to understand the cognitive processes that shape people's views in this space. I think we're pretty early in that. Things like memory and salience. What are the most salient things that people notice? What's the role of political leadership? Do people actually listen to their politicians? So when their politicians make speeches, do they have durable impacts on people's views and beliefs? Do they listen to experts? Again, I think the evidence is limited that they do. And trust is a major issue. Who do you trust? Of course, I could go onto the web tomorrow or in 10 minutes' time and see 20 different pieces of, no time at all, 20 pieces of different analysis. But which ones do I trust? Which ones do I think are going to be the ones that shape my view? And we're really only beginning to understand this. It's a hugely important issue of which there's a lot of research going on. But my take on this, and others may disagree, is that we are a long way short of having a really clear picture of this. So what are we seeing? What we're seeing in Europe in particular is what I call disruptive politics. And here's one dimension of disruptive politics. For those who believe in this issue, there was one round of disruptive politics which they would have liked, which was the rise of green parties. The big kick-up, by the way, in green parties was after Chernobyl. I've got some work with my co-author Torsten Persson, where we look at party entry immediately after the Chernobyl disaster. And there's quite a big increase in green party activity across Europe in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster. But what's been the big story, of recent times, it hasn't been entry of more green parties. There have been some green parties that have entered. It's been radical right parties, many of which do not have supportive views on climate. And I'll come back to that. So how should we respond? I'd say there are two diametrically opposed views. One is we need to pass power up. We need global governance. We need more activity, say, by the European Union, more activity by the UN. The fact our governments are not operating means you need to pass power to people at a higher level who will operate. And some people would say preferably run by technocrats who aren't going to have all of these political considerations that are messing things up. But there's an equally vocal movement that says, no, it's about passing power down. It's about having more grassroots action, more deliberation. I just pulled this out from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, a recent report they published on we need to talk to each other more. We need to have more citizens' assemblies, a kind of passing down to the citizens. or more protest. That's the only way we're going to go. So that's kind of more micro politics, not more macro politics. I'm not sure either. I mean, given these views are diametrically opposed, you have to adjudicate between them and decide which of them you find more persuasive. I think in some dimensions, and maybe that's something we can get into with Tara. What we are seeing, and this is a phrase that's getting increasingly used, is an evidence of a green lash now. A green lash, this is from the cover of The Economist a few issues ago, of the idea that linked to the rise of radical right populism, we're actually now seeing a process of reversal on all of these policies. Here's an example of green lash in the European Parliament. So this is from some work that two of my colleagues, Luis Garicano and Adam Brzezinski, did, where what they did was to look at speeches in the European Parliament before and after the invasion of Ukraine. If you remember, the invasion of Ukraine led to a spike in energy prices. And they're able to look, they know the precise date on which, of course, that happened. And they're able to look at debates in the European Parliament before and after. And there's a dramatic shift in the rhetoric of politicians in the European Parliament, both saying there's less need to address climate change. So they actually don't just say it's too expensive. They actually say it's a less important policy. And of course, they say it's not warranted now because energy prices are so high, we'd be pushing them up even more. And moreover, where's that being driven by? And you won't be able to see, or you won't have time to study these bars. It's being driven by the radical right getting very vocal in the European Parliament on these issues. And the Green Party is getting very quiet. Even the Green parties are not standing up and saying this after that. They feel it's not the right time, or for whatever motives, that they're being quieter. So there's a shift. On the one hand, you're getting the more vocal. On the one hand, on the other hand, you're getting the less vocal. So this is real. Green lash is real. And we cannot have a serious political economy of climate change any longer that doesn't think about these issues, a political economy of sustainability. Now, this is linked to a wider set of issues, and I'll just sort of wrap up with a few thoughts on this, about the capacity of governments to deliver at all. And there's a debate that's fueled in different ways. In the US, it's called the abundance debate, because there's this book by Thompson and Klein that you may have seen called Abundance. But the question of whether we now have governments in the climate and other areas of policy that simply cannot deliver for their citizens. And a good example is building infrastructure. A lot of what we need to do to support the nature and climate agenda is to renew our infrastructure. For example, having more carbon-friendly forms of energy production. And not only is this holding back climate action, but it's also hurting growth and undermining confidence in government. Well, why do I stress undermining confidence in government? Because a lot of people are using this as a basis to say this is a failure of democracy. And I'll tease you with this, probably be the last thing I say. I wholly reject that point. Why do I reject that point? For a few reasons. But one is what the data say. So what I've done in these two charts is to take two well-known measures of the extent of regulation of the environment, and I've broken it down by democracies and non-democracies. Most of the serious action on climate is happening in the world in the democracies. It's not happening in the non-democracies. And that's true whether you control for income or not. Now, a lot of people, the fact that China made a major announcement on climate recently, say, well, if only we were like China, if we were an authoritarian regime, we'd be fine. Unfortunately, the data contradict that. For the time being, at least, the data say that the best way to deal with the climate is to remain a democracy, not the contrary. Okay, I think I'll leave there because I had a few more slides, but I'm conscious of time. So I'll wrap up there. Hopefully I've said enough to provoke the discussion, and Tora will take that up in subsequently. Thank you.